Hello all, and welcome to our First Monday's presentation of the 2020 to 2021 academic year. Today we welcome back one of our own. Kristin Dumais is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and of course she's also a graduate of this hallowed institution, Dordt University. She's written for a number of outlets, including Religion News Service, Christianity Today, and also the Christian Century. Her most recent book, published this June by Live Right Press, is Jesus and John Wayne, How Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And today she's going to be speaking to us on the topic covered by that book. So we look forward to hearing her presentation, and we welcome warmly Dr. Kristin Dumais.
Hello, Dordt University community. It's an honor to bring to you a First Monday's lecture. Although I will admit this is not quite how I had envisioned it. I am here in my office in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but I am optimistic that I will also be able to be there in person for conversation. I want to thank all of those at Dordt who made this possible, President Hoekstra and Leah Zeidema and Emily Rao and all of those who've worked behind the scenes to make this happen. I thought I'd begin today by through a personal introduction, starting with my own time at Dordt. It was just a college back then. You have to go back about 25 years when I first became a Dordt student myself. My 4 years at Dordt were wonderful years, incredibly enriching. I had an amazing education there. If you've read my most recent book, you'll know that I also met my husband at Dordt. I sang in the choir, and that Dordt has been such a formative time in my life, intellectually and spiritually. And socially. Some of my close friends, roommates in college remain good friends to this day. So it's an honor to be back again, remotely or in person. At Dordt, my education really equipped me to think critically. To think critically in every situation. What does it mean to respond obediently to God's word? What does it mean to do all of our disciplines, to approach all of our disciplines as Christians and seeking God's truth? What does that mean as a history major, as a German major? What does it mean as a musician? All of these things. And I was pushed in each and every class unrelentingly to press for what is a distinctively Christian approach to this set of issues. And I absolutely loved it. I drank in Reformed theology, Reformed teaching, and I took that with me into graduate school. I went from Dordt into the University of Notre Dame, where I decided to pursue a degree in American history with a focus on intellectual and religious history. And I found that I was well equipped coming from Dordt to engage in that work. My first semester at Notre Dame, I had a kind of surprising, unexpected change of plans in my course of study, because for as rich as my Dordt education was, as formative as it was for me intellectually, I had never studied women's history. I think I only read one book written by a woman my entire 4 years at Dordt. I could be wrong, but looking back, I can only remember one. And of course, things have changed. This was back in the 1990s. But when I got to graduate school, my very first semester there, I read a book in women's history on early America, colonial history, a book about gender and race, how ideas of masculinity and femininity changed over time. And I was blown away. My understanding of gender had been limited to essentially women in office. Should women serve as ministers, elders, and deacons or not? That was a huge question when I was growing up in the Christian Reformed Church. And to me, I understood that the questions were important. but I thought they were rather boring, honestly. It was either yes or no. And there didn't seem to be much fruitful conversation from my perspective, at least. And if you weren't interested in being a minister or elder or deacon, it didn't seem all that relevant to me at the time. When I got to graduate school and I started reading books in women's history, in gender history, it really blew my mind, and I understood that there was so much more to gender, so much more to ideas of masculinity and femininity, to what it means to be a man or a woman in any particular moment, how these ideas are linked to broader historical developments, to economic changes, to questions of foreign policy, and yes, to questions of religion. And so I was really motivated at that time to explore these questions further. And I switched my course of study, shifted it to include the study of women's history and the history of gender. My first book then, which grew out of my dissertation, really was an attempt to understand how my own Christian upbringing kind of meshed with what I was learning in terms of women's history and the history of gender. And particularly the question of feminism. I had grown up kind of absorbing ideas that feminism and Christianity were not compatible. There's a lot of friction between the two. But as I started to look at the history of American women, I encountered many Christian women who were also women's rights activists. And so I wanted to tease that out. The result of that project ended up being my first book, and it's A New Gospel for Women, Catherine Bushnell and the Challenge of Christian Feminism. And in that book, I look at one figure in particular, a Methodist woman, Catherine Bushnell, late 19th, early 20th century. She was an internationally known figure. And her claim to fame was that she was a global anti-trafficking activist, to use contemporary language. She, first in the United States and then across the British Empire, worked to bring attention to the trafficking of women and the abuses of women. Now, in her work, she very quickly discovered and was horrified to find that time and again, it was actually Christian men, respectable Christian men, who were perpetrating these abuses against women, often horrific abuses, in the United States, in the lumber camps of northern Michigan and northern Wisconsin, but also in the British Empire. And here you had Western Christian, quote unquote, civilized men who were abusing women of color, women in colonial India, in Singapore, and throughout East Asia. And this was a dilemma for Bushnell. How can Christian men and respectable Christian men justify these actions? And she ended up looking to the scriptures and discovered that there had been mistranslations for centuries and erroneous interpretations of several key scriptural passages that actually propped up this abusive system. And I'll be giving another talk on that and go into more details. But for me, the real takeaway from that research, a couple of points. One, that advocating for women's rights and orthodox Christian theology and Christian belief could be compatible. And so that was one takeaway. But there was an even more powerful takeaway, and that was Bushnell's own theological work. And particularly this insight that she had, that to her, as she understood the gospel of Christ, at the heart of the gospel was Christ's divestment of power, giving up power, the incarnation, and the sacrificial atonement. And that led her to wonder. She did a lot of translation work, a lot of hermeneutical work, but at the heart of her project was this dilemma. How could Christian men who claimed to be following Christ, and if this is the model of Christ that we're working with, divestment of power, how could men claim power over others, particularly over all women? That to her seemed antithetical to the gospel message, and it conflicted with how she understood the truth of the scriptures in several key passages. So that's what I took away from that initial project. I ended up getting my first full-time teaching job once I finished my dissertation. Just 2 weeks after I finished my dissertation, I ended up starting work at Calvin University. Back then, just Calvin College. And I started teaching, and it was wonderful to be able to be in the classroom and to teach American history. And I don't remember exactly which semester this was, if it was in my first year or early in my second year. But there was another incident that happened that kind of redirected the course that I would take through my research. And the scene is classroom U.S. history survey, recent American history. And I had been lecturing on Teddy Roosevelt. It's a great example, I thought, to bring a little bit of my own training, my own expertise into the U.S. history survey. And I was lecturing on Teddy Roosevelt and how he exemplified how gender worked. And he was all about kind of militant Christian or militant manhood, and it had a Christian aura. And I was intrigued and wanted to share this with my students. So I showed how his view of kind of white masculine power was linked to what was going on in terms of economic changes at the time, in terms of U.S. imperialism, foreign policy, Spanish-American War, and it was this nice little unit. After that class, two students came up to me and said, "Professor Dumais, there's a book that you need to read." And this was that book. This was back in 2005, 2006. They gave me John Aldridge's book, Wild at Heart. Now, back in 2005, 2006, this book was all the rage in Christian circles, in college dorm rooms, in church small groups. And they said, "You need to read this book." And I did. And immediately I understood why. The book opens with a quote about Teddy Roosevelt and goes on to kind of present a Christian masculinity in the pattern of Roosevelt's model, an aggressive, even militant model of Christian manhood that really emphasized this kind of militancy that every man, Aldridge wrote, has a battle to fight. And God is a warrior God, and all men are made in his image. And so they need to be warriors themselves. And women, very different. They are beauties to be rescued. And they can share in a man's adventure, but every man has this militant adventure, and that is his call to live that out. Now, this was very interesting to me at the time. First of all, just how it resonated with Teddy Roosevelt and what had been happening earlier in the 20th century, or a century earlier. And it also intrigued me because this was right at the time of the Iraq War. And we were seeing survey data that was rather startling, that white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support not just the Iraq War, but also preemptive war than other Americans. They were much more likely to approve of an aggressive foreign policy and to condone the use of torture. And to me, as a historian trained in gender and an understanding of how gender is linked to the American nation, I wanted to see how these pieces fit together, how this best-selling book, which went on to sell more than 4 million copies, might be linked to what we were seeing in terms of foreign policy. So I started to investigate. And then, after a year or two, I set the project aside. Temporarily was my plan, and I did so for two different reasons. The first was, it was incredibly depressing what I was finding as a Christian myself. The books I was reading, the sermons I was listening to, I found incredibly disturbing and disheartening. And I wasn't sure, as a Christian, if I wanted to be shining this bright light on what to me seemed like the dark underbelly of American Christianity, this kind of militant masculinity, ruthless embrace of militarism. And related to that, I wasn't sure how mainstream this was, right? I wasn't sure if this is a fringe movement, and again, do I want to shine this bright light on it, or was this closer to mainstream and really required a careful look? So I thought, I have other things to do. I needed to finish my first book, turn the dissertation into the book. I had a couple of kids along the way. Life was busy, but I kept meaning to get back to the study of evangelical masculinity and militarism. Eventually, the time came to do so. First, let me say that in the intervening years, I didn't forget about the topic. I continued to gather information. I continued to watch what was going on in white evangelical circles. And I was incredibly disturbed to observe year after year, one after another of the men who were preaching and promoting this militant model of Christian manhood had become implicated either personally, directly, or indirectly in sexual abuse scandals in churches and Christian organizations. So I just kept gathering information on this, watching from afar. Fast forward to 2016, almost exactly 4 years ago, the release of the Access Hollywood tape. And what we saw at that point, we'd already seen overwhelming white evangelical support for an unconventional Republican candidate, Donald Trump. But with the release of the Access Hollywood tape, this seemed to come into question. Would family values, evangelicals, the moral majority continue to support a man like Donald Trump, who we had on tape really confessing to sexually assaulting women? We saw a few evangelicals waver over the course of that week, but within a few days, nearly all were back to supporting him. And it was then that it dawned on me. We've seen this before. There's a long history of white evangelicals propping up a certain type of militant, even ruthless masculinity, sexual abusers, being willing to excuse or deny or very quickly forgive these sorts of trespasses for the sake of protecting their brand, protecting the witness of the church, protecting their power, their political interests. And so at that point, I picked up the old research, dusted it off, and I wrote a piece on evangelical masculinity and militarism, and I published it the week of Trump's inauguration. That piece went viral, and I started hearing from so many evangelical men themselves who told me, "You're exactly right. Please keep doing this. Please keep researching this." And so I decided to go ahead and turn it into a book. So now I'm a historian, and one of the first questions that I had to confront was, where do I start? Where does this history start? Where do I need to go? And I knew that it was really the 1970s that things start to take hold, but I needed to go back farther than that. And so in the beginning of my study, I give a quick glimpse at the 19th century, particularly in the American South and evangelical circles in the South, where we do see a kind of militant masculinity, a culture of honor in which white patriarchs are take upon themselves to ensure social order by exerting power over women and children and also enslaved Americans. And so I knew that there was this precursor where religious Americans, where American evangelicals had justified a kind of oppressive masculinity and patriarchy according to their faith. And I knew as a historian that this would feed into 20th century American evangelicalism and up to the present. But history is not just about continuity. There is a lot of change as well. And I knew that in the 19th century, there were also models of Christian manhood and evangelical masculinity that prioritized self-restraint, a more gentlemanly way to be a Christian man. I also knew that kind of fell out of favor by the early 20th century in the North as well. And we see the rise of what historians call muscular Christianity. The idea that the old model of self-restraint was no longer up to snuff. The world had changed, the economy had changed, the nation had changed, and it felt like Christianity too needed to change. And older models of self-restraint became labeled, rather than noble and masculine, they got labeled as feminine or effeminate, emasculating. And so in the early 20th century, we see this embrace of muscular Christianity, this rugged Christian manhood. But again, change over time. At that point, it wasn't just conservatives who embraced this. Liberal Protestants, too, eagerly embraced muscular Christianity. Which brings us to World War I. This is where we really see this muscular Christianity take hold and used to justify American militarism, used to justify war. Here too, though, it's not just conservatives who embrace this. Guys like Billy Sunday absolutely do. They're waving their flag on top of a pulpit and calling all Christian men to go to war. But there are also many liberal Protestants who eagerly embraced this Christian masculinity and militarism. There were also conservative Christians, many conservative Christians in the First World War, who did not embrace militarism. They did not believe that America was a Christian nation, and they did not think it needed to be defended militarily. They were separatists and thought that, Christianity, to be Christian, you need to be saved, and America doesn't have a soul to be saved. And so you have a lot of different things going on in the early 20th century. And so the story that I wanted to tell really starts to come into the shape that we would recognize today in the 1940s. And that's when conservative evangelicals come together to form the National Association of Evangelicals, and they want to kind of rebrand the movement. They're not kind of backwater fundamentalists anymore. They aren't relegated to the margins of American society. They want to reclaim their rightful place at the center of America, at the center of American power. And they really start this movement during the Second World War, and Billy Graham is right at the heart of this, preaching a kind of Christian nationalism and also gender traditionalism, this kind of strong Christian manhood at the heart of Christian America. By the end of the 1940s, we have World War II kind of very quickly morph into the Cold War in terms of what's going on in broader American history. And this is where things really start coming together. We have, in the Cold War, the battle between right and wrong seems so clear, especially for American evangelicals. They see communism and the communist threat as anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American, and it is a military threat. And so they believe that it needs to be met through military means, and also through strengthening the faithfulness of American Christians on the home front. And they really embrace this model and believe that as they consider themselves the faithful remnant of American Christianity, they have a special role to play in making America Christian, keeping America Christian, and keeping America strong to ward off the threat of communism. So this gets us into the 1950s and 1960s, and evangelicals really do move closer to the heart of American power, led particularly by Billy Graham, right, pastor to the presidents. And then the 1960s happen, and this is an incredibly disruptive decade for all Americans, but American evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals, feel this keenly. You have the disruptions of the civil rights movement. Many evangelicals support basic civil rights for African Americans. Some Southern evangelicals vehemently oppose those and are, in fact, looking for ways to reassert segregation. You also have the rise of kind of second wave feminism, the women's movement. And many evangelicals see this as a disruption to what they consider to be traditional God-ordained gender roles. And you have Vietnam. And this is the real kind of Cold War battle. And by the 1970s, it is abundantly clear that things are not going well. And for evangelicals who believe that that Christian America needed to be defended militarily, this is a huge crisis. And then when they look at what's going on the battlefields of Vietnam, they start to question how this could happen, because isn't God on our side? And so they think we need to reform and redeem America. We need to be more faithful, more obedient, more moral. But they also think that, is there something wrong with our men, with American manhood, that strong, young American men cannot defeat this ragtag enemy on the battlefields of Vietnam? And so this is the 1970s. This is the period when conservative evangelicals really coalesce into a partisan political movement. This is the time when we really see the religious right take hold, and this cultural identity of an embrace of white patriarchal power and a militaristic expression of that for the sake of Christian America and in order to be a faithful remnant in this country, where that really starts to take hold. Okay, we don't have time to go through all of the last 75 years, so let me just fast forward now to the 1990s, because we have the end of the Cold War all of a sudden, and these old models seem outdated. Where do we go next? What do we do? And this is a huge question in evangelical communities. The 1990s are a time of a lot of disruption. What should evangelicals be doing in terms of politics? What does it mean to be a Christian man? Ends up really being a key question for white evangelical communities. Some of you may be old enough to remember this, if not your parents are. This is where we see the rise of the Promise Keepers movement, the big evangelical men's movement that grabs national attention. Now, the Promise Keepers, feminists did not like it. They saw this as a reassertion of Christian patriarchy and the religious right in disguise. But in fact, Promise Keepers was a diverse movement. In many ways, it was a step back from this traditional kind of patriarchal masculinity. And you had a lot of different answers to the question, what does it mean to be a Christian man? You had egalitarian answers that kind of stepped back from patriarchy. You also had people questioning kind of the whiteness of white evangelicalism. There was a move, especially within Promise Keepers, but throughout American evangelicalism, toward racial reconciliation at this particular moment. And within the men's movement, there was the embrace of emotion, and in what that looked like in terms of masculinity was an embrace of what was called soft patriarchy. So still patriarchy, but be really much nicer about it, and gentle, and servant leadership is part of this. And then when it came to what does it mean to be a Christian man, a lot of the books embrace this idea of a tender warrior. So you need to be a warrior, but you need to also be able to be tender. And that's really how to understand the tensions and the conflicts and the questions in evangelical circles in the 1990s. By the end of the decade, though, there was already a backlash against this. Too much tenderness, too much softness. This is not good for the church, and it's not good for America. And so by 2001, you start to have a new slew of books appear on the shelves of Christian bookstores. James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, Doug Wilson's Future Men, and Wild at Heart, publishes in 2001. And all of these are championing a kind of testosterone-driven masculinity. God made men dangerous, and he did that for the good of the church, for the good of the family, for the good of the nation. And that's where you have very, very militant models. Now, what was interesting to me in particular about Eldridge's book, and then more and more of these as I started to read them, is how, despite their claim, to be Bible-believing Christians, these books didn't have a whole lot of Bible passages in them, and not very solid biblical exegesis, to be clear. Instead, they looked for Christian heroes outside of Christian circles, especially to Hollywood. They loved Mel Gibson's William Wallace in the movie Braveheart. He was this model Christian man. They loved mythical warriors and cowboys and soldiers and General MacArthur and General Patton. And I was surprised to see over and over again John Wayne. John Wayne kept popping up as this ideal model of Christian manhood, of American manhood, which, if you know much about the life of John Wayne, is kind of surprising, but it wasn't his life so much as the image that he portrayed on screen. Now, this was interesting to me as well because I understood that this very militant brand of Christian masculinity, in fact, contradicted many of the teachings at the heart of the gospel, many of the teachings of Christ himself. Love your neighbor as yourselves. Love your enemies. Right? The fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. These do not make for a very militant manhood or a militant faith. But these values, these biblical teachings, were largely set aside, often explicitly so. You don't need to turn the other cheek. You're not going to be able to defend your family and your faith if you do that. And instead, they embrace this model of a militant Christian manhood that was, again, largely based on secular models. But then in doing so, they ended up kind of redefining their theology itself so that the Christ of the Gospels became a warrior Christ. And again, many of his teachings ignored, and instead they kind of turned him into this militant warrior and then said, we're going to model our lives after that militancy. And this was in the early 2000s. And this is when we have the Iraq War, we have the War on Terror, the rise of Islamophobia, and we also have within evangelical circles this kind of militant masculinity really kind of seems to be taken to extreme measures. This is where we have Mark Driscoll, the Mars Hill Church, extremely misogynistic, crass, militaristic, and he influences a generation of young evangelical men and countless evangelical pastors themselves. And there are all sorts of kind of copycat, smaller scale pastors and writers who are imitating the success of Eldridge's Wild at Heart, the success of Driscoll's Mars Hill Church, this militant Christian masculinity that really starts to permeate the evangelical subculture. And it aligns very closely with the kind of culture wars politics and militant mentality more generally. At this point, we'll fast forward again to the presidency of Barack Obama. And you can really start to understand evangelical opposition to Obama, not just because of particular policies, but because of this militancy and the way in which what happened time and again in evangelical churches and institutions where leaders who were promoting this particularly militant form of Christian manhood and militant form of Christianity itself would very intentionally work to create fear within their communities, to incite fears in the hearts of their followers about the great threats. Right? The Cold War had ended, but now there was the threat of Islam, the threat of terror, the threat of feminism, the threat of liberalism, and these fears then were real in the hearts of their followers. And then the strong leader, the strong man would promise protection. And so there's this relationship that fear led people to militancy, but militant leaders also stoked fear. And that gets us really to 2015 and 2016 when we see unexpectedly Donald Trump arrive on the scene. And in many ways, he contradicted traditional Christian teachings, certainly what we think of when we think of family values, evangelicalism, but in some very key ways, he aligned with some of these more militant values. The idea that you needed a strong man to protect vulnerable people, to protect a vulnerable faith, to protect a vulnerable nation, and you needed to be ruthless. And Christian virtues needed to be set aside from time to time. Just like John Wayne, sometimes it was a man who had been formed by more secular values, who was the best equipped to fight the fights the battles that needed to be fought in this critical moment. And that rhetoric, if you have eyes to see, if you have ears to hear, was everywhere in evangelical circles, conservative evangelical circles in 2016. And so you have Robert Jeffress, who spoke here at Dort in early 2016, famously quipped, we want I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what that we can find, and I think that's where many evangelicals are. And so you see this kind of come together. There are many reasons that many white evangelicals, the vast majority of white evangelicals, supported Donald Trump, but I think this needs to be part of our story. At that point, 2016, then, I decided to go ahead and write this book, Jesus and John Wayne, and I'll say just a couple of words about this book in closing. The title, Jesus and John Wayne, I think you have a pretty clear sense for the John Wayne part of it at this point. It's a cultural history, and it's looking at evangelicalism as a popular culture, as a consumer culture. It looks at the popular books they read, their Bible studies, the podcasts they listen to, the television and radio that they consume. And I think that this is really key to understanding white evangelicals as a cultural movement. And then it also looks at how culture has influenced evangelicals, and often kind of secular models, such as people like John Wayne. And that's something that I think that evangelicals themselves and Christians should probably wrestle with and examine a little bit more carefully. So that's the Jesus and John Wayne part. Perhaps the more controversial part of the title is the subtitle, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. One reviewer has called this book urgent and sharp-elbowed, and I think that is accurate. And I made this choice for a couple of reasons. I do think that situation is urgent for both the church and the nation to step back and rethink, what does it mean to be a faithful Christian in this moment in all areas of life. But I've also seen, by doing this research and spending years observing the subculture, I've seen how time and again deference to abusive authorities can actually facilitate an ongoing abuse of power. And I've seen that in churches, in families, in organizations, when it came to the sexual abuse of women and children in particular. And so I wanted to not participate in that kind of deference. So that explains a little bit of the sharp elbows. But I will also say that the subtitle, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith, is making a bit of a normative claim. As a Christian myself, and as a Bible-believing Christian myself, I wanted to speak to evangelicals on their own terms and ask this question of, is their witness in the world right now, is it consistent with the biblical values that they claim to hold dear? And in fact, I've had a number of conservative evangelicals thank me for that part of the subtitle, for understanding that there is a Christianity and there is an evangelical Christianity that is different from the ideology that I describe, that's different from the story that I tell. The book has been out for 3 months now, and I have been utterly overwhelmed by letters from evangelicals themselves, a couple hundred at this point, and more come in each and every day. Evangelicals who say, this is the story of my life. You mean you wrote my biography without even knowing it? And this is not the faith that I want to practice. This is not the faith that I actually believe in my heart. And so there's this strong movement of introspection, of self-reflection, and I think all of us can be participating in this in many different ways. And this is not a partisan issue. ultimately, it's not even primarily a political issue. It's an issue that we are all, it's more than an issue. It's a calling, right? It's who we are as Christians, and maybe particularly as Reformed Christians, to continually ask the question of what does it mean to be faithful and obedient in all areas of life, in our particular historical and cultural moment. And that's a lesson that I learned so clearly here at Dort. And I hope that this book can be received in a way where it's seen as one small contribution to this larger project that we are all involved in. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with many of you, to answering many of your questions, and to hearing your perspectives on this all. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar and viewing Kristin's talk on her recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, and I have my copy here with me. And I am delighted to welcome Kristin to campus in this short 10-minute chat where we can process some of the ideas that she presented during her talk this morning. Kristin, thank you so much for being with us in some sort of unusual ways during this time of COVID.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. I'd hope to be there in person, but yeah, we'll make this work.
Yeah, and Kristin gets to visit some classes over the next couple of days, and as well present another talk this evening in a virtual format with a Q&A after as well. So Kristin, one of the most interesting group of students, and I think one of the largest group of students who's probably watching the presentation this morning, are our Core 100 students, and they're in our first year seminar. And one of the things that I so appreciate about your talk is the way you narrate your personal journey and how you have made discoveries from your time at Dort to today. They're investigating how their stories fit within God's story, and that's exactly what you've been doing. When I read the book and talked with some faculty members and students about it, one of the most intriguing ideas was about the nature of evangelicals. And really the whole book is talking about what does it mean to be an evangelical today?
Yeah.
And you present lots of ways of thinking about what it means to be an evangelical. But if someone walked up to you on the street in Grand Rapids and said, Kristin, what do you think an evangelical is? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so, a lot of people define evangelicals as a set of theological beliefs, so kind of you check these boxes, the authority of the scriptures, conversionism, the atonement, and there you are, you're an evangelical. And there are reasons for doing so, but I think there are limitations too. So when I think of who is an evangelical, it really is somebody who has been shaped and formed by this broader evangelical culture, which includes theological ideas, but it also includes a kind of cultural identity, and that they've largely been shaped by that, not just from sermons that they may hear in an evangelical church, but by the Bible studies that they read, by the radio that they listen to, by the TV that they watch. Really, it's this larger cultural identity that I think is really critical to understanding how faith formation actually happens, right? How each of us comes to hold the values that we do and comes to understand our faith in a particular set of ways. So for me, actually consumer culture is really something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. And I think that speaks to the experience of ordinary believers, right? These things that shape our values, that shape our commitments.
Mm-hmm. I was struck as well by it's really the last sentence of the book itself where you say, what was done might also be undone.
Yes.
Is there maybe someone very personally that you look to in our evangelical culture, or maybe outside of our evangelical culture today, who you think is trying to undo? Someone that's trying to chart a course towards a new way of being faithful.
Yeah.
The new old way of being faithful.
Right. There are many evangelicals right now who are trying to just rethink the commitments, political commitments, kind of biblical commitments, just kind of recalibrate. And so this is a widespread movement right now, and I'm hearing from so many people right now who are involved in this process. But I do think history is important, because if you just start right now, it's kind of hard to see what has to be undone, what kind of deconstruction, how we got to this point. And so I think history is an essential part of this project. In terms of, naming one individual, it's hard to pick out any one. And so I'm going to kind of dodge that question and instead suggest that, I think it's really important for white evangelicals right now to listen very attentively to people outside of their tradition, and particularly the tradition of Black Christianity, Black evangelicalism, if you will, that there are many powerful voices right now that hold the same kind of biblical commitments, the authority of the scriptures, the atonement of Christ, who have charted and have long charted a very different path. And I think that we need to have conversations, not by inviting one or two of these folks into our spaces, but really leaving our spaces and being attentive to the vibrant faith that has been happening outside of one particular tradition. And so that's really what I've been trying to do personally, and where I would urge other people to go as well.
I love that idea of leaving our spaces open for new ideas and new people. When you think about a college age, someone who's in their first year here at Dordt, perhaps, how could you encourage a student to leave spaces open? What are some things that students should be reading? What kinds of conversations could they be having? Maybe in their first year seminar class, or as they work their way into a discipline during their next few years of study at Dordt.
Yeah, I think that many college students. So I teach a lot of first year students here at Calvin. I think many come very open to learning already, right? That when I hear from my students, I actually almost have to do the opposite of say, learn your tradition, know your tradition, because they feel like they're coming to college to just, decide which of their ideas they're going to reject and which new ideas they're going to embrace, which is absolutely part of the college experience and is wonderful. But as a historian, I also want each of my students to really understand where they're coming from, right? Where their parents are coming from, understand which ideas have formed them up to this point, so that they can maybe more intelligently decide which of those they really want to hold fast to, and which they might want to reconsider. And that reconsideration, I think, really does come from just listening to voices who are different from you, but who hold the same core commitments, right, within the Christian faith, especially. So listening to other believers, not that we don't need to listen to people outside of the Christian faith, right, but at a Christian university, there are going to be people coming from all over the world, from all different walks of life, and to just be very attentive to the different perspectives that they can give, and those relationships, I think, are most important in over time, kind of just changing your or just opening you up really to other ways of thinking, other ways of being, and they can really enrich your own faith and your own experience.
And so when you or a college student who's investigating an idea or proposing an idea, when you have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, I think one of the most challenging things is to disagree civilly. How do you do that in your own work? I'm sure you've had lots of conversations with folks who've read your book and disagree with some of the ideas in the book, or maybe even some of the history in the book. How do you navigate disagreement well?
I mean, asking questions is a really good place to start. Where are you coming from? What have your experiences been? Tell me a little bit more about that. And then it's easier to understand, oh, okay, so this is where you're coming from, and these are the ideas that have shaped you. And this is, what I was actually studying here. And there are some connections, but, you're actually participating in a different tradition, or, like that can facilitate these conversations. But I mean, honestly, I think that history is somewhat disarming, in that so much of the book, Jesus and John Wayne, is a work of history, right? And and while you can contest different interpretations of that history, a lot of it is just very carefully evidenced, and it's not really up for grabs all that much. And so I feel like when I had the luxury of having 300 some pages and hundreds of footnotes to kind of start the conversation. And so I've found that the conversations around this book have actually been incredibly productive and not at all antagonistic, surprisingly so. Perhaps, but again, just having this kind of common, when you can hold things in common, whether it's an understanding of the past, a shared history, shared theological commitments, and you really look for those commonly held values, and then you go from there. And to be honest, that's why I think that such good conversations can happen at Christian universities, because we aren't coming from all over the map, right? Well, I mean, in some ways we are, but we still have this common commitment to the Bible, to the kind of overarching story, to the Jesus of the Gospels, and we're all trying to discern things together across our differences. And that's why I actually find that Christians can have the best conversations, and if we know how to have those conversations the right way.
What a great jumping off point for the students who investigated this morning, is finding common ground with what you're saying, and then be able to pull that conversation into their classes in the coming week. And I'm so sad to say that we're out of time already, but there is another chance to interact with you and your ideas. This evening, you'll be presenting a talk called Christianity and Feminism, A Tangled History. This is a webinar format again, and there are still about 30 spots left. So if you would like to continue to engage with Kristin on some of these ideas, especially regarding gender studies this evening, please see the email that you were sent earlier today, and there's a link that you can click on to sign up for the webinar tonight. And then after Kristin's talk, we'll have a chance to take questions from the audience. And it promises, again, to be a really fruitful place to start and continue great conversation. So Kristin, thank you so much for presenting the ideas in your book and for chatting a little bit this morning.
Thank you.
You're welcome.